This time on Poll Hub, yet another mass shooting and yet another replay of the thoughts and prayers versus this time we have to do something political play. But the shooting in Maine has produced some tiny slivers of movement. We're going to discuss that. Then new research shows Americans with college degrees live longer than those who don't have them. And the gap is growing. We're speaking with one of the study's authors to understand what's going on and why it's a peculiarly American problem. And we finish with a fun fact for all of you Bigfoot and Chupacabra fans. I can't believe I actually was able to pronounce that. Stick around. Let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Mary Griffith.
And I am Lee Maringoff.
Well, today we begin with familiar and horrific territory. Last Wednesday, October 25th, there was yet another mass shooting, this time in Maine. This time, 18 people killed and 13 left injured. As opposed to previous mass shootings, there has been a little bit of change in perception, not among the public per se, but among some of our political leaders. Jay, why don't you pick up from there?
Yeah, we've done segments on this topic, sadly, too frequently. And I think, Lee, you'd agree. We end up saying kind of the same thing, which is Americans want tougher restrictions on assault weapons by big majorities and lots of other gun control measures of some sort, and yet nothing ever changes. And here we saw a tiny change. The most conservative Democrat in the House of Representatives represents Maine, Jared Golden. And he said in the aftermath of this shooting in his own state, I was wrong to oppose an assault weapons ban. That has put pressure on the two senators from Maine, both of whom are as moderate kind of as you come in their parties. One is an independent, Angus King, who caucuses with Democrats but is pretty conservative, and Susan Collins, who of course is one of the last of the remaining vaguely liberal Republicans. There's been pressure on them because both of them have opposed assault weapon ban as well in the past. I wonder, though, if one congressman, if that one thing is that a tiny sliver that gives you hope that there might be some change coming where the American public opinion is represented better in Congress, or, Lee, does it seem like it'll be a footnote in the history of this?
Yeah, unfortunately, to me, it seems like it's only in my backyard kind of reaction. I'm pleased to see that from a personal standpoint, but I can't see this as a stampede going that way because there's been so many others in so many other states and it hasn't moved people. I would say, first of all, several things. On public opinion, just to reiterate, it's not just that the American public supports it, the ban on assault weapons. It is Democrats, independents, and a majority of Republicans and gun control owners. It's not like this is some extreme thing being pushed by the left on the rest of the country. The country is there. The leadership is not. I would say also in this, the answer beyond thoughts and prayers very often is we don't need gun control bans, even though they were very effective during starting with the Clinton administration and I guess stopped during the Bush administration, did have a positive impact. But the answer has been it's mental health. If we could just address mental health, and then the funding for mental health is not there, and that this particular person was under the treatment of the mental health system. And then the next thing you hear is, well, why didn't someone in the family do anything about some kind of mass killer? And the answer in this case is they did. They notified the police. So we went down a long, lonely road. Nothing is obviously bringing the people back. We checked all the boxes on this one, and it doesn't seem to move enough of the Congress. And I guess from the standpoint of those who would like to see changes and a return to the assault weapons ban, the only thing is the ballot box at this point, because I don't think there's enough folks who are going to move. And it's not just the NRA contributions. They're not giving zillions of dollars. It just seems that no one wants to move in this direction. So anyways, that's my soapbox on that.
Well, Lee, you mentioned public opinion on this question, and let's just focus in and underscore that. A new Morning Consult poll was out this week on Tuesday and showed that more than two-thirds of Americans, 67%, support a ban on assault weapons. That includes 82% of Democrats, 61% of independents, and 53% of Republicans. This is something that we've seen often. And Jay, in previous podcasts, we've talked a lot about this misalignment between our political leaders and public perception. In fact, we talked about crime stats last week, and there's a different perception between what is versus what Americans think. Why do you think on the issue of gun control, there's this disconnect between public opinion and just our leaders overall? I mean, the new Speaker of the House, he's coming back to the idea that Lee mentioned about thoughts and prayers and not really committing to any type of bringing any type of gun control legislation forward.
Yeah, actually, he's had some even more interesting comments about blaming the structure of the family and what kids are learning in school about the reason for the mass shootings in America. I think it comes back to the way that our political system's set up in terms of primaries and an extremely concentrated number of very small number of seats that can flip one way or another. Everybody else is in a safe seat. So in the House, 90% of the House members are in basically safe seats. And so they only speak to the most extreme members or the most active voters. They're not always the most extreme, but the most active voters in their party for the primaries. And in the Republican Party, the most active voters in primaries are the most pro-gun. And I don't know that it's an NRA thing. It might be a cultural thing. I don't know what it is. There's been a lot of research on this, and I don't think there's a definitive answer. But if you're running in a primary and you're going to get primaried by somebody who says, no assault weapons ban, and you're a Republican, you're probably going to lose if you're supporting an assault weapons ban. And so until that changes, there's lots of things this applies to, but specifically with guns, no matter if there's a majority of Republicans who support an assault weapons ban or not, I don't see it happening unless people who support an assault weapons ban, which in this case, for the most part, are Democrats, were to gain a big enough a majority to be able to pass an assault weapons ban back into law like we had in the 90s.
Yeah, I'll say just two additional points on this. To me, if Sandy Hook, which is not too far from where I'm sitting right now, if that didn't move the country in a stampede in this direction, I'm not sure what it would take, and we've had so many other mass shootings since then. And the other point I would say is for all those who offer all these reasons why, we can't move ahead on gun control, it did work when it was in place. There was a reduction in these assault weapon shootings, and in the United States of America, we're not doing very well relative to other so-called developed countries. They're doing something differently than we're doing, and it works better for them than it does for us. So we're way down on the list, and this is a sad chapter, I think, a tragic chapter. Mary used the word horrific in what our country's all about right now, and there's probably not much worse than what's been going on. So you can only hope that some light shines down upon these decision makers or they get replaced.
And so let's change gears here. We want to talk about a study that we ran across that is both fascinating and really worrisome if you look at American society as a whole and some of the changes that have happened over the last 15, 20 years. We think about political and cultural and societal changes. This kind of hits on all of those, and it's about our life expectancy. Research done at Princeton University has found that if you have a college degree, you're going to live longer in America than if you don't. That's the simple way of explaining it. But we want to talk to one of the authors of this study to dig a lot deeper on this. Sir Angus Deaton, who is a senior scholar at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He has a Nobel Prize in economics from 2015. Is that right, sir?
Yep.
Yes. And we're not going to call him sir, we're going to call him Angus. So Angus, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
I'm very pleased to be here.
So your research shows not only that there's a gap that is beyond 8 years now in difference between life expectancy of those who have a college education and those who don't, but that's grown significantly over the last couple of decades. Talk to us a little bit about what you found and why it should worry us, or maybe why it shouldn't. I would think it should.
I think it should. We're very much on the side of saying this is a problem, and it's signaling deeper problems in American society that we see in other forms, like political polarization, like people being very angry. So I think it's ever since people started looking at education and life expectancy, the more educated people lived longer. And that's not a big surprise. And it could be because education is good for your health, or it could be because healthy people are more likely to get educated. So you don't really know which way around this goes. So the big part of this study is not that there was a gap, but that the gap is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it was pretty big even before COVID. And during COVID, it got bigger still. So what is that? And why is it such a problem? And it's partly because American life expectancy, if you take everybody together, has not been doing very well for a long time. If you compare it with other rich countries, it was about the same in the mid-'80s. It was sort of in the middle of the pack. But by, into the 2010s, it's just worse than, the 21 other rich countries that we looked at, sort of fallen out of the bottom of the pack. And so there's been a lot of concern about that. The National Academy has put 3 reports together looking at that. And, we smoke more and we're a bit fatter than many other countries. And, that's an important part of the story. But it's getting so much worse recently. And then what I want to do is tie it to the first thing I told you, which is if you put the split by education, people with and without a 4-year degree, on top of all those European graphs, that the people with a 4-year degree or more are, like the Swiss or Japanese. They're doing just fine, thank you very much. And the people without a 4-year degree have sort of fallen off the bottom of the world. And that's the tragedy of this thing. I should say one further thing. Only a third of the American adult population has a 4-year college degree. So it's not like a tiny minority that's really suffering. It's a big chunk of the population.
Yeah, first of all, again, thank you very much for joining our podcast and also with such an incredibly important study result here. And I want to underscore the fact that not only is this a wide gap, I mean, in 1992, the difference was, I believe, 2.5 years. And now, it's 8.5 years now in the gap. And that's just not subject to just chance variation. Those are real huge numbers from not too long ago. One generation has sort of bottomed out on these numbers. Clearly, when I'm looking at these, I think about the United States relative to other countries, and then I do understand that we have so many people who don't have a college education, and so this has to certainly be an awakening for them. Did you also look and control for race factors? Were there gender issues? Were there other kinds of demography that played an explanation into these differences, in addition or other than education level?
Yeah, the gap has been widening a little worse for women than for men.
Okay.
And that's true in most countries in the world, or that women are doing worse. And it's sort of because women took up smoking much later than men, and they've been slower to quit. So we sort of know what that is. And so the benefit of quitting smoking is coming to women later. The thing about African Americans is interesting in that there's always been a gap between blacks and whites in favor of whites. Mm-hmm. So white mortality rates are lower than black mortality rates. Life expectancy for whites is higher than for blacks. But this division by education is happening within the African American community too.
Oh, okay.
And what's more is, if you look at these life expectancy numbers, it used to be, if you go back to 1992, you didn't get much of a benefit if you were African American from going to college. There wasn't much of a gap. And now there's a huge gap. So the gap between blacks and white mortality rates in the US is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, but it's still, the familiar way around. Whereas the gap between education is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So what you're seeing is that the blacks with a BA have long passed the whites without a BA in terms of life expectancy. And so you've got this convergence going on, and it's not converged. Even within education groups, blacks do worse than whites. And it's also true that the fraction of blacks with a 4-year BA or more is about a quarter instead of a third for whites.
That's fascinating, because one of the things that we're also looking at, just in terms of the data as it's coming in, is not the difference between whites and blacks alone, but when you look at education, the difference between blacks without a college education and blacks with a college education, and that may be not maybe as much as, but certainly an important distinction. And now you're saying it also applies to life expectancy issues. So we're seeing that education seems to be becoming more and more dominant force in here. And as you say, is it the cart before the horse before the cart? That answer doesn't matter as much as the differences. The bottom line is education matters.
I'm told it's also happening even within incarceration.
Wow.
You're getting many more less educated whites in jail. And so those gaps are coming the same way. Mm-hmm. But this, to some extent, this is new. I mean, I come from Britain. I was used to class. We lived with a class society. And education seems to have started doing that in America. I mean, these people have become a sort of underclass. And it's not just, it's a whole bunch of things. I mean, less educated Americans used to have unions. There really aren't any unions left anymore. Mm-hmm. So they've lost a lot of political power that came with unions, both locally in their communities and in national politics. I mean, Alphabet now spends more on lobbying than all of the unions put together. Now, the healthcare industry has 6 lobbyists in Washington for every member of Congress. And so there's been a big shift in power towards this educated elite, who are, of course, the managers and things of all these companies, and away from less educated people. And so this is the more controversial part of our work. We're seeing this gap, this widening gap, as being a serious indication that something has gone wrong with less educated America.
You didn't see this, I just want to be clear, you didn't see this in other countries, this education gap. In Western European democracies or industrialized world like us, you didn't see the same thing, is that correct?
Well, you see the gap. The gap certainly exists, and I suspect that's universal. I think if you went to the moon and there were people on the moon, there'd be an educational gap. But what you don't see is this universal widening. And it's a little hard to look at because the 4-year BA is not such a strict dividing line in Europe as it is here. But the only other place we found historically that less and more educated people's life expectancy was going in different directions was after the collapse of the Soviet Union in Russia and Eastern Europe. And, if that's what we're comparing America to, my God, what a terrible place.
So to what extent, though, does that have to do with the availability of quality health care that is, it derived largely of income, but that's so aligned in America with education? That seems like it could be a corollary with in Eastern Europe, where only the people with college degrees had enough money coming out of the collapse of the Soviet Union to be able to afford health care, while the healthcare system for everybody else collapsed. So what extent do you think that our not particularly great public health care system in this country is leading to this?
Well, there may be something, but it's, I think, a little too easy to match health with healthcare. I think when you're looking at population level mortality rates, which is what we're looking at here, that the healthcare system probably doesn't have a first order effect, maybe some. Because if you're talking about smoking, for instance, that's a big deal in this. The drug epidemic, opioids, are a big deal in this. And that's been driving up a lot of this thing. That's not much to do with healthcare. They're not very good at pretending people doing opioids. Suicide is rising very rapidly in the US. It's one of the very few countries in the world where that's happening. And once again, the increase is only among people who do not have a 4-year BA. I mean, there's basically no increase in suicide among people with 4-year BA. That's not much to do with the healthcare system. And in fact, the healthcare system, if you count pharma as part of that, what we're seeing in the courts now is, Purdue Pharmaceutical, J&J, Mallinckrodt, all those guys, they weren't exactly on the right side of this. So, maybe not having this aggressive, very expensive healthcare system was actually good for people, for other people. It is true that we don't have much of a social safety net. So, when China, all the factories go to China, you get treated a little better in Europe than you would here. And some people on the left take that as a very important thing. I'm open to it, but I don't know for sure.
I think this is one of the most important studies that we've talked about on the program, on the podcast. And I know this podcast alone is not going to change public policy, but I'm interested in the reaction you've gotten to this. Obviously, we've seen it. Have you found that this has created the beginnings of some knowledge expansion that you feel may have some policy implications?
For sure. I mean, something I should have said at the very beginning is, I'm the junior author on the work. The senior author is my colleague and wife, Ann Case. And, her name's all over this. She's been at it since the very beginning. So we're encouraged about the policy response. A very early acceptor and pusher of our work was Janet Yellen, for instance.
Oh, okay.
She talks about it all the time. She mentions it. She's really into it. She talks about deaths of despair, all of this sort of stuff. And, our dean at what is now called the School of Public and International Affairs, our boss was C.C. Rouse, who was President Biden's first chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors.
Okay,
so, our work is well known in Washington. And of course, you can't connect up the dots, but we're very encouraged by what's happening in Washington. And this problem is sort of coming to the fore. It's true. I mean, the great dividing line here is there's been some criticism that, people just don't see. They say, okay, these people are less educated or not doing very well, but we can think of a million reasons for that. No one made them take opioids. No one stuck needles in their arms. No one made them commit suicide. And, the opioid companies, we agree, they would say, we're really bad actors in this, but that's not the same as a wide social decay and problematic. And we think it is, but, you can't produce direct empirical evidence, which is going to nail that one way or the other.
Well, I fear there's more noise right now as to what the value of a college education is, as to what the disadvantages of not having a college education. So I'm a little worried about that end of the debate. And then if you overlay this with that discussion, that makes me very, very worried about what the future is. So that's why I asked you that question about, are there other ripples of fact that are seeing the light of day on this? Yeah.
Exactly. That's true enough. I mean, in something as big as this, you can't nail down all the causal mechanisms that are at work here. So it's very hard to know. We don't really think that much of this improvement relative to people without a BA is coming from having a BA itself. Mm-hmm. We think it's more to do with the way that people without a BA are being treated and who are living in a world in which they have little political power, their jobs are going to China, and also that we have, governance in the U.S. over the past 20 or 30 years has been largely run by a white educated elite. And there's very little voice of working class people in that. And, also in my book, I've argued that I think the way we teach and think about economics has not been always very helpful in this either.
Mm. So you would argue the bottom has fallen out more than the top has risen?
I think the top is doing okay. And, there may be some slowdown in health progression there. But, people like us live in a different world. And that world's a pretty healthy world where progress is still going on. And, the economy is doing great compared with Europe, but they don't have the bodies piling out.
Right. Yeah. Very different outcomes in these places. Well, Sir Angus Deaton, Senior Scholar at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Angus, thank you so much for joining us and sharing you and your wife's work with us. And it is, at least to me, encouraging to hear that you have an audience with people who can make a difference, and that this research is being seen by people who understand that it is evidence of symptoms rather than a cause per se, but a symptom that we need to address so that we can try and get more equality, some more equality, and closer to what the rest of our allies, the people in those countries, live like. So thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for helping spread the word, Jay and Liam. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, really unusual topic in the fun facts today. Creepy cryptids. And I hope everybody knows what that means, but that has to do with all these mythological monsters out there who have become the subject of much folklore. So Axios actually did a poll and they had like one of these. It looks like the charts for the basketball playoffs, stacking one against the other. So they had, I think, 16 entries, and they all knock each other off. And we came down to 2. And I object. I think this is a problem myself, but we have Bigfoot, and Bigfoot did not win. And I just find that hard to accept. And because the winner, I actually don't know what that's about. Jay, you pronounced it in the beginning, so I'll let you get another shot at it.
Okay, it's a chupacabra.
Okay, do you know anything about this? Because if it's in my neighborhood, I want to know about it right now.
Well, so I would answer that, but Casey is shaking her head yes, and I only know because I read up on Wikipedia, which doesn't count. Casey? Talk to us about the chupacabra and why a chupacabra would be a better mythological beast than a Bigfoot.
Well, so a chupacabra is a blood-sucking kind of dog-goat thing.
And so this is fictional.
Not to some people.
I take exception with of the 16 choices on here. I did not see the Loch Ness Monster, which I would have thought was your winner. I would have put everything. Mary Griffith, tell us about what happens in Queens when people want to know about mythological characters.
That's a whole different question, Lee. I honestly don't have a whole lot to say on this topic. Just that it's come down between the chupacabra and Bigfoot. I, like you and Jay, I believe, did not know a whole heck of a lot about the chupacabra prior to this fun fact. And I think if anyone were to see our faces during this podcast and this topic, they may or may not be surprised, because I think we're a little bit speechless.
So,
Jay.
but really,
also,
my favorite part about this isn't the winners, the chupacabra versus the Bigfoot. And let's be clear here. Chupacabra won 51-49. It was a squeaker.
Yeah, it was a cliffhanger.
Yeah,
it was a cliffhanger.
They may hang from cliffs. I don't know. But the starting 16 were Mothman, a Loveland frogman, the Michigan dogman. You're picking up some states here. The Dover demon, which I think some people may think is related to Biden since he's from Delaware. I don't know. The Fresno nightcrawler. I mean, the Fresno nightcrawler, that sounds pretty scary to me. It also sounds like a serial killer. But cryptids, who knew?
I agree that this poll is null and void. If the Loch Ness Monster or lake monsters in general are not on this poll, it is 100% invalid.
I'm not sure who was responsible for this. Athen, were you responsible for this, or was this you were responsible? Okay, so Athen, what do you have to say about creepy cryptids and why you think this mispronounceable word
Chupacabra
beat out Bigfoot, and why do you think the Loch Ness Monster didn't even make the cut?
Well, I found this while I was searching online and for other polls, and I thought it was amazing and goes perfect with the spookiness of the Halloween season.
Oh, there you go.
And I think the Chupacabra won because it's the scariest to look at, but I think it's also, like, if you read the stories about it, like the most deadly one. I think the Loch Ness Monster is international.
Yeah, I was just noticing, Asim, that now that I'm looking at it more closely, it's all American mythological creatures.
I do rely, Athen, on learning a lot from my students, but I think this is probably the most I've ever in my 48 years at Marist have been exposed to about something I just did not have a clue in. So I would have been a Loch Ness Monster voter myself, but I'd have to write in the name because this is not under the creepy cryptids that you have. So I thank you for coming up with this and renewing my faith in the value of our student body. I appreciate that, Athens. I can't tell you how much.
We were playing at an old dance hall.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Athen Hollis, Hannah Toad, and Rebecca Hendricks.
If you enjoyed Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review. Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcast app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.
Chupacabra, coming up from South Texas.